Well, hello, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and delighted to be part of this very interesting and inspiring series of seminars. And I hope I will be able to contribute usefully to the debate as it has developed so far. So my assigned task today is to bring a European perspective on the Scottish Revival Renaissance. I intend to focus on the Scottish Renaissance, that is the movement that spans the 1920s, between the 1920s and the 1960s, conventionally divided into two waves, and whose influence has stretched well beyond these decades, arguably to embrace the pre-devolution era as well. It is possibly a good idea to start by defining very briefly this perspective with 50 sovereign states and roughly 225 indigenous languages, not to mention numberless regions and nations within the states, and numberless dialects, which are very often as clearly distinguished as state languages are. The truth is that any single definition of Europe, including the one of the most resilient ones, the heart of the so-called Western world, will fail to capture or even to do a vague justice to the extraordinary complexity of the European pluriverse, a concept which could use to replace the Eurocentric notion of the pristine West. What has been labeled as Eurocentrism refers in fact to a conceptual apparatus or set of empirical beliefs that favors Europe over the rest of the world, and that was shaped mainly in the age of European empires and is still lingering in the world that we live in. This apparatus has been in fact largely generated by and centered on the same state nations which expanded their territory and political cultural influence by occupying neighboring regions and countries, as well as non-European ones. Between the 18th and the early 20th century, the borderline between what we described as colonization proper, a more or less explicit process of establishing control over foreign territories, and assimilation, a more silent and discrete process whereby minorities are integrated voluntarily or not in the majority societies, is not always so clearly demarcated. The imperialistic and centralizing ideology that dramatically reshaped world political maps in this period has arguably evolved in the post-war period into a less definite but nonetheless pervasive pressure of assimilation in the name of a centralizing internationalism or globalization, very much calibrated to the values and demands of the countries that have dominated economically and politically the world scene since the 18th century. But the modern history of Europe is also made of continuous acts of resistance to overarching worldviews, and is, and indeed has always been, characterized by tensions between major and minor cultures, between large and small states, between centripetal and centrifugal forces, always at work in the nation state. So the Europe I'm interested in then, and which represents an ideal backdrop against which we can reevaluate the Scottish Renaissance, is the minor Europe, with its continuing dialectic with and displacement of the major. Deleuze and Guattari famously investigated Kafka's work as an example of minor literature in a major language and by a major or canonical writer. So many more literary works and voices remain invisible and inaccessible to most of us, and we can only be acutely aware of the huge potential that these largely untapped sources represent and how much they could enrich and widen not only our idea of Europe, but our cultural understanding of different local contexts. I now wish to focus on the idea of Scottish Renaissance, more precisely on how this idea was conceived and the repercussions it had on the construction of Scottish literature as a field of studies in the 20th century. This critique will be then addressed not so much to individual texts or authors, but rather to scholarly interpretations and representations of literary Scottishness in this period. So I would like to make a few four concise points. The first pertains to the conventional idea of the Scottish Renaissance, still shared by many, if not all scholars in the field, as a movement initiated and led by Hugh MacDiarmid. According to this quite resilient perspective, McDermott is not simply the most representative or most canonical writer of this movement, but the measure against which other expression of Scottish literariness are gauged, a presiding spirit, so to speak, who ended up informing much of 20th century criticism. This is problematic in more than one way. With no desire to question the immense interest of McDermott's cultural project, I would contend that to bestow centrality on his contribution implies a hierarchical perspective on a period of Scotland's cultural and literary history that was in fact much more fluid and multifaceted, as more recent research, including the present workshop, has demonstrated. This equals more or less to the majorization of the minor, so to speak. A second concern regards the very notion of Renaissance, a term that, if used retrospectively, may indeed be employed, at least in theory, to acknowledge or capture the scope and depth of a cultural event. If used as it is in this case to announce the beginning of a new cultural era, it takes on an entirely different meaning, that of implementing a revolutionary project rather than observing its unfolding, or artificially directing and controlling change rather than simply recording it. Third point, inscribed in the idea of Scottish Renaissance, there seems to be a romantic sense of irreconcilable localness and in great difficulty to relating to wider critical categories. Unlike other periods of Scottish literary history, from the Middle Ages to Enlightenment or Romanticism, or indeed even post-evolution writing. It is only in relatively recent times that the Scottish Renaissance has started being compared to other movements, mainly so far across the Northern Atlantic archipelago. Michael Shaw's excellent fin de siècle Scottish Revival, extending its investigation to countries like Belgium and Japan, is in this and other senses a pioneering work. The fourth and last point, very much related to the third, the Scottish Renaissance does not travel easily, academically speaking. Outsiders will easily feel daunted by the only too often imperviously nationalist approaches privileged, unless, of course, they specifically engage with these approaches. I'm one of them. The bias whereby a Scottish literary work has to focus on Scottish issues, topics, or has to convey an orthodox vision of the Scottish nation has been discussed before by other colleagues. And it is one, not the only one to be fair, of the reasons why this may be perceived as an inhospitable terrain for scholars not directly involved with them. Again, I would claim that it is not the localness of the Scottish Renaissance that affects its ability to speak across borders, but the fact that localness and its perceived uniqueness is not presented as comparable, as able to breathe a literary life of its own, and thus to be displaced, to be able to be displaced from the narrative of Scotland and re-embedded elsewhere in similar or dissimilar contexts. I'm fully aware, of course, of the complex and difficult and also immensely interesting political and cultural history of 20th century Scotland. But while I can easily trace the limitation I have just hinted at in this remarkable history of resistance and creativity, I'm also keenly aware of how the Scottish Renaissance, not as a cultural movement as such, always open to new readings and interpretations, but the resilient literary paradigms it generated still provides an interpretive obstacle for critics seeking to get beyond the now conventional narratives of the Scottish nation. Now, back to Europe. In my short introduction, I have implied that minor Europe may easily, naturally provide a more hospitable territory for fruitful encounters, comparisons, but also for multidirectional displacements. I would contend that it is these possibilities of encounter and displacement that make a literary text able to create an imaginative order that can stand apart from its original place of production and from the specific context in which it was created. There are two ways in which we can foster encounters and displacements. One is the more conventional quest for influences. In a nutshell, a reconstruction of actual exchanges between writers across nations, of tours and journeys made by writers beyond the borders of their countries, of books read and imitated, appropriated, and rewritten. The acknowledgement and mapping of factual influences is, of course, extremely important, and there is still much work to do. However, no matter how desirable and fruitful, this approach may be still seen as part of a vertical model, where the agents of the encounter are given the chance to develop a conversation across borders, but generally in order to keep or even reinforce their identities and claims rather than to question predetermined ideas on each side. A second model, less practiced in the Scottish context, is that of contrapuntal reading. This is a term that has been used in different contexts, and I will refer to the version, the adaptation by Susan Starfall Friedman, that of a dynamic and associative reading practice that involves a stepping out from the historical method and of a linear order to focus on different networks of meaning. Friedman calls the method collage, that is a form, I'm quoting, of comparative thought based not on using one element as the standard by which another is measured, but rather on encounters. End of quote. This allows Friedman to redefine modernism as a planetary plural event. And modernism is revisited, I'm quoting, as the aesthetic dimension of any given modernity, end of quote, and can be found in any time and place where, quote, transformational rupture and rapid change occur. Adapting Friedman's approach to a similar context, I imagine we can take the notion of revival, Renaissance as equally capable of traveling across time as well as space. Let me have a go at a contrapuntal reading of this type. Lewis Grassie Gibbon, aka James Leslie Mitchell, is possibly the most eloquent example of a Scottish Renaissance writer who has suffered from an approach that has favored his localness and national specificity over other more cosmopolitan aspects of his quite vast, contradictory, and also uneven literary production. Again, I would definitely list the International Companion, edited by Scott Lyell, as the first excellent move beyond a strictly vertical model of reading. Since his untimely death, Gibbon, arguably the most prominent writer in the Scottish Renaissance canon after MacDiarmid, has been almost consistently constructed vertically as the author of The Scots Square, and within that trilogy of Sunset Song with Chris, as it is represented in the latter novel, taking center stage. My choice of pairing Gibbon with Pasolini originates in a number of reasons. The most conspicuous being my lifetime profound interest in both writers, the most accidental, the extra time provided by COVID disruption that allowed me to reread and reconsider some of Pasolini's works. I'm sure that you're all familiar with this remarkable Italian writer, film director, and thinker. His work very much focused on and rooted in the specific and dramatic social and economic changes that swept Italy in the post-war and post-fascist era did make a worldwide impact. But perhaps none of you are aware that in the first part of his career, he devoted himself to the retrieval and reinvention of Friulian culture and language. Friulian, a Romance minority language spoken in Friuli in the northeast of Italy, was Pasolini's mother's native language. His father was from Bologna. Pasolini lived in Casarsa, his mother's native town, between 1942 and 1950 when he moved to Rome. In that period, he collaborated with local poets and intellectuals, founded the Accademiuta della Lingua Furlana, the Little Academy of the Friulian language, wrote articles for the journals published by the Accademiuta, wrote and published some of its finest collections of poems in a literary, hauntingly beautiful Friulian, and he often engaged with and represented the peasant world of that region. And while he eventually moved away from Friuli, geographically and culturally, when he was trialed for seducing 3 boys, lost his teaching post, and was expelled from the Communist Party, his interest in the peasant world remained quite central in his understanding of modernity. The minor and minorities in all possible dimensions, language, culture, class, gender, defined all of Pasolini's work. It became a deliberate ideological lens through which he interpreted Italian as well as world history. Comparing the work of these two writers, I will refer to Gibbon's Scott Square and to Pasolini's Friulian literary output as particularly rewarding, if only a little risky. It provides us with an example of how blurring boundaries and forming analogies across time and space can allow us to identify connections and widen our understanding of individual authors and texts. Gibbon and Pasolini obviously never met and were unaware of each other's existence. They came from two different worlds and cultural frames, and yet there are non-linear ways in which we can compare their work. Again, let me proceed by concise points, just two of them this time. One, would either writer describe his work as being part of a revival Renaissance movement? Probably Pasolini would have rejected either term as too conventional. I'm not aware he ever used actually this term. And Gibbon was at least partly ill at ease with the discourse of the Scottish Renaissance as it was being shaped by his colleague MacDermid. But certainly both writers shared a nostalgic gaze for the past, an archaic past embodied in the peasant world. This is a world that they had come in contact with in their childhood, and that by the time they reached adulthood had reached the end of its history. In Scotland, the end had been accelerated by World War I. In post-war Italy, by what has been described as the quickest and most traumatic process of industrialization in Europe, different but comparable context. Also related to this, both writers pen haunting and memorable descriptions of the rural landscape of their respective regions. A nostalgic gaze is at work here too. But what is perhaps most interesting is that they deploy a similar strategy, whereby the synchronic horizontal image of the self located in a definite time and space and within a local community overlaps with the diachronic vertical image that links the subject to previous generations and eras. I'm thinking here of Chris and the Standing Stones, and for those who have read it, The Turks in Friuli by Pasolini. And if you haven't read it, there is an excellent article on the PMLA, which appeared quite recently, a text written in Friulian. The mourning for the death of peasantry represents then a strong link between the two writers, as much as an indictment of the horrors of industrialization and modernity, even though at this level, the creative paths of the two writers take separate directions. Both writers chose to write in a literary adaptation of a peripheral dialect language, Mearns Scots for Gibbon and Casarsa Friulian for Pasolini. The former stood for a remote Britain, remote being the term that would most commonly be used in British English in this context, the latter for a lesser Italy, and this is Pasolini's self-conscious definition. For Gibbon, to use Scots as the language of narration was relatively innovative and transgressive at a time when the use of dialects was stigmatized and discouraged in the UK. But even Pasolini's use of Friulian, in a country where dialects are today still widely spoken, was in the late 1940s and 1950s a more challenging act than it would seem today. The use of dialect in speech or any form was politicized by the fascist party and discouraged by the state as an anti-fascist expression, if not downright forbidden. Pasolini's choice of Friulian for his first collection of poems may indeed be seen as a way of challenging the domination of Italian, identified here as a post-fascist or indeed fascist middle-class language. Not dissimilar from Gibbon's stance, openly critical of the middle classes and their Burns cult. Finally, a note on the two languages, a further note on the two languages that can be both described as artificial in the sense that they do not coincide completely with contemporary historic varieties. In a certain sense, both languages can be described as literary meta-historical languages. I am borrowing Pasolini's phrase here, un linguaggio poetico senza tempo, senza luogo, a timeless, placeless poetic language, as opposed to the hegemonic languages that have been corrupted by the linear progression of bourgeois history and thus are not poetic anymore. In both writers, therefore, contamination becomes not just a linguistic, artistic strategy, but a political, ideological one. By way of conclusion, the thematic ideological clusters I have briefly considered in relation to Gibbon and Pasolini are especially valuable as they reveal a wider picture than that can be reconstructing by mapping individual and specific influences. It is a picture that tells of affiliations and intersections that run deeper than individual exchanges and contacts that pertain the deep structures that unite our seemingly incompatibly different regions and countries, cultures, and worldviews. I have no doubt that there are many more examples of writers across Europe and beyond who responded to the threat posed by modernity and industrialization, to the death or decline of old ways of living and speaking, to the centralizing ideology of states and empires in similar ways. A horizontal movement does not preclude a vertical one, it enhances it. Thank you.